I was 33 years old, well over 400 pounds, and food was my prison. And then I learned that food had the answer to my questions, and my kitchen had the cure for my disease. When I was 400 plus pounds, and I don't have an exact number because I had actually blown past the scales that all had that weight limit. Life was all about the food. I was deeply struggling with a processed food addiction. There was this little voice inside me that said, if you don't do something, you will not make it to 40 years old. And that's when I really just fell in love with the idea of how can I be my best self? So I was fighting for me and fighting for my health. When I went plant-based, my whole relationship with food changed. I realized how much better I was feeling. I feel like I'm firing on all cylinders. That's magic to me. And the weight just sort of slowly melted away, which is something I never thought was possible. Now, food prepping for me is a joy. I celebrate the quality of the food. It's just very rewarding. Healing starts at home. Mine did. And so can yours.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm Dr. Lori Marvis, and today I'm very excited to welcome someone across the pond, and I'm really interested in seeing just all the amazing differences between the UK system and the American system. But welcome, Dr. Nitu Bajekal. How are you today?
Thank you, Lori. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so excited actually to continue our chat, and hopefully the people who listen to your podcast will benefit from what we have to discuss.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. There's many things because of your specialty being OB-GYN, and there's so many things that women struggle with. But before we get there, I always like to kind of make this a little bit more personal and learn about your background. So can you tell us a little bit about, first of all, where you hailed from originally, and honestly, what made you decide to go into medicine?
Okay, that's a longish story, but I shall try and make it a bit short. So I was born in India. I'm South Indian. If you know India, the geography, I'm South Indian by birth, but actually grew up in Calcutta, or Kolkata as it is known. So I'm a Bengali at heart. So I have to just hear words spoken in Bengali and my heart sings. And it's something that is very close to me. And I was meant to go to medical school in Kolkata. My father was an engineer. My mother was a teacher, but she actually held down 4 jobs. And what happened, my father was a very hands-on father in those days. And I was very blessed in many ways, because I didn't really consider myself as a girl. I have a brother in between, an older sister and me, and all 3 of us were always treated exactly the same. It was only when I went to medical school at the age of 18, I suddenly realized, wow, I'm actually a girl. There are differences here. And so it was quite refreshing for me now looking back as to how advanced my grandparents and my parents were. But we were an isolated nuclear family in Kolkata, and we were vegetarian by caste, if you know what the Indian system is. However, my mother was an atheist, and my father was an agnostic, because we came from the so-called upper caste, or the oppressor caste, as I like to call them. So basically, we were not eating any meat or eggs or fish, but my mother was doing that from an ethical point of view. And so she was occasionally, I would go to my friend's houses. Bengal, or Kolkata, where is the capital of Bengal, is quite a heavy fish-eating, meat-eating state. And contrary to what people think, most Indians actually do eat meat rather than not. It's because of the cost factor that they don't eat. And so this idea that India is largely a vegetarian country comes from the fact that mostly the privileged come out into the Western world. And so you think that they are predominantly vegetarian. So I would occasionally go and taste some goat, and my mother would be quite horrified, and she would say, oh, why are you doing that? Don't you realize what's happening to the goats that are being tied up? Because in India, the butcher shops are often quite next to your home, and you can see them crying because of the fact that they know they're going to follow their brother or sister. And I said, they're actually already dead. And so I did eat some meat a couple of times a year, probably. But predominantly, I would say, actually whole food plant-based with a bit of dairy and a bit of oil, because they were very expensive in those days. And so we really couldn't afford to have a lot of that. So it was I was very sporty as well. And my father was particularly happy because I had polio before the polio vaccine had come in, and I had a mild attack. Now, looking back, because obviously I wasn't left with anything other than very mild, weakness in one of the legs. And polio is a very dangerous virus. And now I'm so pleased that it's eliminated because of the vaccine. And, hundreds and thousands of children would die from respiratory problems and then or be left disabled with paralysis. And so my father was always very proud because I was very good on track and field events. But in India, you didn't have that option of getting a scholarship to do sports. So my sister first became a doctor, and then my brother became a doctor. And so I thought, you know what? Can't do anything else. Let me follow what they're doing. So I didn't have any reason to go into medicine when you were asking me. A lot of people know from the beginning. I didn't. I just thought if you're good in studies in India, you either become a doctor, lawyer, or an engineer. And so I chose medicine because my sister and brother were there. And thank God I did, Laurie, because it was the best thing I ever did in my life. It was absolutely spot on, the profession that has never failed to thrill me and excite me. And I joined medical school 42 years ago, and I was very fortunate. I went to a wonderful medical school, one of the top medical schools on the seaside, a French town called Pondicherry, deep in the south. And I met my wonderful husband now, those years ago, we were in the same year. And within a few years, when it came to choosing the subjects, I knew very quickly that OBGYN was the subject for me, because it had that perfect mix of surgery. I knew I wanted to do surgery. It had the perfect mix of medicine, but it also had a lot of psychology. And I just loved the fact that I was able to combine all these three and actually, train in a specialty that ticked all those boxes. And so for me, I have never felt at any point any regret except just joy that I chose such a wonderful specialty. Highly intense, though. There were very few women because of the long hours. And so that was tough. And so we moved to Delhi to do our residency. Again, it was one of the top medical schools in All India Institute. And we were 29. We had sat every possible exam in India, and we had just had our first daughter. And we thought, there must be more. We can't settle down to becoming consultants at 29 in a big teaching hospital. I just didn't feel that was right. We said, let's go and see the world. And we didn't want to go to the US because we heard people don't come back to India. So we went to the UK. And of course, we're here 30 years later, no regrets. And that's to do with the NHS. The National Health Service in India, in the UK, for me, epitomized the way I wanted to practice medicine, free at cost, without having to ask the person who has walked in through the door, pregnant or with HIV or with cancer, what is your financial status? None of that has ever needed to be asked. And I just loved the way I could practice medicine. And so we took a decision to stay, and we both became consultants about 22 years ago. So that was over the time. And then when I came to the UK, I was pregnant with my second daughter, and I saw a couple of programs on the television. And those couple of times that I was eating chicken and things like that, without realizing, because in India, you often don't see meat on the bone. You often see it in little pieces. So once a month, we would go into town and splurge, and we would have some dairy called paneer and some chicken, because we were vegetarian hostels. And I never thought much about it. And I saw these couple of programs, and I was pregnant. And for me, this was like a little switch, and I became completely vegetarian. I didn't know the connection between dairy and meat at that time. And my brother then came shortly after that from the US, and he was vegan, and I still didn't get it. I didn't understand it. Maybe I wasn't willing to listen. And so fast forward, and my younger daughter, who currently lives in New York, she was about 9 or 10, and she came home having grown up eating sausages and things outside, said, I'm going vegan. And I said, what do you mean? Why can't you be vegetarian? And she said, Mom, don't you understand that red equals white or white equals red? And I said, I don't understand that. So she said, Mom, the white milk that you're drinking or you're making me drink becomes, the cow has to go to the slaughterhouse in 2 or 3 years because she can't produce any more milk. So, just because you're eating dairy, don't think you're not eating meat or contributing to the carnage. So for me, it was like a light bulb, and I became vegan. This is about 22 years ago.
Wow.
And it was really hard because obviously there was nobody else that we knew who was vegan. My brother was in the States. My parents and my sister became a vegan, but my immediate family and in the UK, all my friends were not vegan. So they looked at me completely aghast, because suddenly I was this person who looked like them, but wasn't behaving like them. And so it was tough for me and my 2 daughters. We would go for these fancy medical dinners, and we would be given an apple. I would be given an apple at the end of the thing, and I would have paid a ton, or a stuffed pepper with some very sad looking rice. Or often nothing, actually, just some white lettuce. And so it was very tough, but I became very quickly very good at cooking and at baking. So I'm here. But the real change came about 5 years ago when I came back from work, and my husband said, I'm going plant-based. And I said, wow, what did I say 18 years later? And he said, no, actually I watched Forks Over Knives because he'd been trying every single diet, keto, paleo, everything. He never ate meat. He stopped eating meat in 94 or something like that. But he ate fish and eggs because he didn't want to make a fuss when he went out. He ate vegan at home, but also he didn't think, he thought it was good for him. And of course, he was getting progressively more diabetic, progressively overweight. And so he decided, after seeing Forks Over Knives, he'd go plant-based, and then became vegan pretty quickly after that. And now tells me, I wish you had forced me. And I said, everybody has their own journey. Everybody has their own journey. But it was the best thing that happened. People often say having children is the best thing that happened in your life. And I love my daughters. But I think the best thing, a gift that was given to me, was when Rajiv turned around and said he was going plant-based. For me, it was a big load off my shoulders. It meant I could start writing my books. I could just be even more myself than before. So that's my story. A bit long, as I said.
No, I love it. So your daughter really was the catalyst for you just to kind of put all that together. And I love that it comes from innocent children. They're just so intuitive and just say it the way it is. It's like, the truth just falls out of their mouths. Like, it's just amazing.
And the other thing that also happened, Laurie, was just before I turned vegan, I actually thought I was very stressed. I was just applying for consultant jobs, and my period stopped. And I thought, oh, I'm very stressed. But what actually was happening is I went through premature ovarian insufficiency. And your listeners may not know what that means. It's basically premature menopause. And anybody under the age of 40, that's not common. So only 1 in 100 women will go through a situation that I went through. And menopausal hormone therapy is really important. But that was the time when the WHI study came out, and I was really struggling, and I didn't know where to turn for help because there was just no information. And interestingly, when I turned vegan, because I was not vegan in the traditional sense, I was really whole food plant-based because there wasn't anything.
Right.
I was a whole food plant-based vegan, wearing non-leather and non-silk, but also eating, food that was completely cooked at home because there wasn't any choices, these wonderful pizzas and burgers and things that we see now that in the UK, in London, where I live, there is so much of choice, which I think is great. Doesn't necessarily always be best for your health, but there is always a place for those foods. And so for me, a lot of my symptoms improved hugely, but the skeptic that I was, the scientist in me, never believed that anything that I had to do, because I was always active, I was always slim. I didn't know that I was healthy. So I didn't realize that what I was eating was actually making the difference, because my parents also were very healthy, and I didn't realize it was their diet that, I just thought it's genetics.
Right.
And it took me another 10 years to understand the science. And I got very upset and angry because all this information was there. And I was seeing 4,000 patients. I was operating on them. I was delivering babies. I was doing complex surgery. And there was something always missing in my toolbox. And that really was lifestyle medicine. And so when I found that out, I started putting it into practice with my patients, but I just felt I had so much of lost time to catch up on. I used to tell my patients I was vegan, and they would try and understand a bit, but I didn't want my patients to go vegan. I wanted my patients to understand it from the health point of view, because the evidence was so staggering that I just felt, oh my God, I have really not helped my patients, because every aspect of women's health, there is not a single aspect of women's health or reproductive health. When I say women, I mean, I want to include those assigned female at birth. So that's very important for people to understand. But there's no aspect of reproductive health that does not benefit, whether it's painful periods, whether it's heavy periods, whether it is optimizing fertility, whether it is optimizing your menopausal symptoms, whether it is preventing dementia or heart disease. More women die of heart disease than men do, preventing or reducing the risk of cancers, bowel cancer, breast cancer, ovarian cancer, womb cancer. 1 in 8 women in the US and 1 in 7 in the UK will get a lifetime diagnosis of breast cancer. And we know a large part of that can be reduced by changing the way one eats and lives. So I've been really throwing myself into this. And I felt that the time had come for me to start, because I go to schools, I talk to the public, and I felt I needed to pen some words down. So hopefully we'll be able to help people who may not be able to, experience or benefit my 35 years of experience.
Absolutely, which is a beautiful segue to tell us about your book and your work, and specifically the PCOS.
Yeah, so about 8 years ago, I set up a organization, a voluntary organization, not charity, because I didn't want to be bossed around by others. I just wanted to use my private practice money into doing some good. And so I set up an organization which allowed me to go into schools where we would do half-day or full-day workshops, where we would teach sixth formers, yoga for painful periods, meditation or breath work before an exam to relieve stress, dancing to improve their mood, and Pilates for core strength, and nutrition. We would make them try a new food that they have never touched before, and teach them about the basics, because a lot of children in the UK would come to schools in the inner cities, especially with a packet of chips and things like that. So I really wanted to do that. And I was doing a talk to about 200 GPs, and I was following on after a breast surgeon. And the topic was how to prevent breast cancer. And this person went up and started talking about breast cancer. But what the words that came out was really about early diagnosis. It was about mammograms, about fine needle aspiration. It was about ultrasound diagnosis. There was not a word about prevention. So I had just started writing my book. This was about 8 years ago. And I said, you know what, there's no point writing a book. I need to go out. And that's when I set up my organization. And anyway, then that continued, and I didn't get a chance to write. And then COVID, the pandemic happened, and I started writing a book on general women's health. When my daughter came along last February, I just literally started penning it down. In October 2020, I put a few thoughts down. And in Feb, Rohini, my daughter, who's co-written the book with me, she said, Mom, why are you writing a general women's health book? You are writing 3 pages on menopause, 3 pages on PCOS, 3 pages on endometriosis. And that really doesn't reflect the experience that you have had for 35 years. You're not going to be able to tell people how to change things. It's a book that doesn't do your experience justice. You should really be doing a deep dive into conditions that you always talk about how patients have made such dramatic changes. And why don't we write about polycystic ovary syndrome? Is the most common endocrine condition, is the most common hormonal condition to affect women and those assigned female at birth in the reproductive age group. And she herself, she said, I have PCOS and I've been able to put it into control. So why don't we write about this? It's such a stigmatized condition because of the signs and symptoms that really prevent people from coming up and talking about it. 1 in 10 women suffer from this condition. We think 1 in 4 women who belong to, Hispanic and Asian and subgroups, including those who are trying to struggle to get pregnant and those who are carrying excess weight, for example. So, it's the most common condition for fertility, cause of infertility as well in women. So it's just not spoken about because the stigma of having acne in your adulthood, living in a larger body, having excess facial hair or body hair, losing your hair from the top of your head, not being able to conceive. These are all very stigmatizing conditions because the society tells us that we've got to be smooth like dolphins. We've got to, pop out children whenever we want to. So that sort of expectation means that people don't come forward. And 75% of women never get a diagnosis of their PCOS, never in their entire lifetime, because they may come and see a gynecologist for missed periods or irregular periods. They may go and see a dermatologist for acne. They may go and see a therapist for anxiety and depression, which is also features of polycystic ovary syndrome. They may go see a fertility specialist. They may go and see a psychiatrist. They may go and see a therapist again for binge eating disorders, or an endocrinologist for insulin resistance, which is so what happens is nobody's joining these dots. They may go and see a beauty therapist for laser hair removal. So you can imagine all these variety of symptoms and nobody's joining the dots. So what I want is to empower the person who has the condition, and hopefully health professionals who read it, because we're getting such good feedback that, you should learn to join the dots and perhaps tell your health provider, listen, I think I have this condition. Can you help me by doing these particular tests? Or do you think you can reassure me that I actually don't have this condition? That was the driving force of the book, is to empower people, whether you have polycystic ovary syndrome or not, is to actually understand your body, understand how lifestyle plays an important role alongside or instead of Western medicine. So it's not one or the other. You may need to have medication, and often medications are very useful in many women's health conditions. So this book is actually not just for those with polycystic ovary syndrome. It's for I have had now so many men write to me saying that they're learning so much from the book, not just about the female reproductive health, but also just generally, because part 2 and part 4 are applicable to everybody. And then it's a deep dive into polycystic ovary syndrome, but we talk about periods and why understanding your periods is so important. We talk about all the symptoms and individually dive into acne and excess weight, all the things that affect other people as well.
That's wonderful. So just to back up a little, can you explain exactly for the audience what PCOS is and why lifestyle intervention is so effective? Yeah.
So PCOS is a short form, but basically it's polycystic ovary syndrome. It is a misnomer, really, which I bust a lot of myths in my book, including case studies. But what one has to understand is there are no true cysts in the ovaries. You're born with a number of eggs at birth, and over time they get shed. And so what happens is that by the time you reach menopause, the number of eggs drop below a critical level, and then your periods stop. So that is what menopause is. So what happens in PCOS is that you can have a lot of immature egg follicles, and none of which actually race to the front and ovulate monthly, because it's ovulation, regular ovulation, that gives you a monthly cycle. So one of the hallmarks of this polycystic ovary syndrome is irregular or missed periods. So PCOS is a metabolic condition. Think of it as a close cousin of type 2 diabetes. That is the best way to describe it. It's the most common endocrine or hormonal condition. Basically, endocrine means that you have organs that produce these chemical messengers called hormones, which are produced in a distant organ, say in your brain. FSH and LH are hormones that will work on your ovaries, which will then release estrogen and progesterone and testosterone. And what I try and explain to people, so this is the most common condition, the most common hormonal condition, and it's a close cousin of type 2 diabetes. That is the easiest way. And the ovaries are not diseased. It just affects the function of the ovaries. And we know this from a very big study from the UK, which looked at 175,000 men, and they found that they also have characteristics of polycystic ovary syndrome. So if you have a brother or a father or an uncle, they may have symptoms of type 2 diabetes, excess waist measurement, they may have high triglycerides, metabolic syndrome, frontal balding of hair. These are clues as to whether you may have PCOS or whether they may have characteristics of metabolic syndrome and PCOS. So we know that polycystic ovary syndrome is not a disease of the ovaries. There's nothing wrong with the ovaries. So although it's the commonest cause of not being able to conceive, there is a lot of hope because it's easier to fix than a lot of other conditions that can affect fertility. Because we know that lifestyle and behavioral changes are the first line of managing this condition of PCOS. And this is not me saying, this is the international guidelines from all over the world. All the experts agree that behavioral changes and lifestyle changes are the key. The problem arises, however, that there is no consensus as to, and so the patient is left wondering, what lifestyle changes? What should I be doing? How much exercise should I do? Is sleep important? What should I eat? And so if you don't spell it all out, and because we know from the all the information and evidence, we know that type 2 diabetes responds beautifully to a whole food plant-based way of eating. We also can see those magical differences. I have patients that have not had periods for 2 years, and then they go on a whole food plant-based diet, and a lot of them will start having periods regularly.
Wow.
And then I have 5 patients currently who are pregnant. So it's so important. It doesn't mean to say that you may not need medication. You might need medication for fertility, for managing your acne or your excess hair growth. So the symptoms of PCOS are wide and varying, like we discussed. The hallmarks are those of androgen excess. So you may have signs of androgen excess, cystic acne that persists after the age of 25, or painful cystic acne even younger, that is on your chin, on your back, on your chest. That may be a feature of androgen excess. Androgens are hormones, the most famous of which is testosterone, and it's not a male hormone. You cannot have estrogen without testosterone because the pathway is cholesterol, progesterone, testosterone, estrogen. So without testosterone, there is no estrogen. So all the people who are listening, don't ever for a minute think that testosterone is a male hormone. Yes, men may produce it more, and we produce testosterone in different amounts. So we have almost 3 times higher levels of testosterone than estrogen in our reproductive age. The ovaries produce that much more, and then it gets converted into estrogen. So it's really important to understand that. So PCOS will have symptoms of irregular or missed periods because you're not releasing eggs. That is the first hallmark. And the second hallmark is signs of androgen excess, losing the hair from the top of your scalp, acne, or excess hair growth. Or you may have lab tests that actually show that you have higher levels of certain hormones. And so an ultrasound can also help to diagnose these little pearl-like immature egg follicles that I said. They're not cysts, they don't cause pain. And so 2 out of these 3 criteria were decided by experts to say, yes, this person has polycystic ovary syndrome. Some people will have all the 3 criteria. So irregular periods, signs of androgen excess, as well as an ultrasound diagnosis. But PCOS often starts in teenage years. And for teenagers, we should not be using ultrasound to diagnose PCOS because teenage ovaries can also have these little empty egg follicles, which look very similar to PCOS. So you have to use the clinical signs and symptoms. So you have to use the acne and the excess hair growth, as well as the irregular or missed periods. So normal periods are between 24 and 35 days. So if you're regularly having periods that are, 40 days apart, 60 days apart, 50 days apart, that is not acceptable. That is not normal, so except maybe in the first year, as soon as you start your periods, and in the year leading up to your menopause. Otherwise, periods should be between 24 and 35 days if you're not on hormonal medication. So it's so important to track your cycle, because periods are a vital sign, because it may be a sign of an eating disorder, it might be a sign of exercising too much, it might be a sign of a brain tumor, and PCOS is a diagnosis of exclusion. So that's why when you miss periods, especially for more than 90 days, I would always recommend that you should seek the help of a specialist or of your family doctor first, so that diagnosis can be ruled out and a diagnosis of polycystic ovary syndrome made. So important that you track your cycles, because I see so many women who think it's normal to not have periods, and it may be just stress and things, but you need to see somebody first to get that diagnosis, and just don't assume it's a normal thing.
So that was fabulous. Thank you. I'm curious though, how would you describe to someone what actually causes PCOS? Because you're mentioning it in youth, in our teens. So is it lifestyle that causes it, or lifestyle that prevents it?
So it's a very complex genetic condition like type 2 diabetes. And there's also epigenetics that come into role, how your grandmother lived, how your mother lived, because all these things influence the baby inside. And so it's never too early to make changes, and it's never too late. But PCOS, we think, has got some drivers. Insulin resistance is one of them. So if you have the genetic background where you, as I said, we have a family member with type 2 diabetes, or a sister or a mother with polycystic ovary syndrome, you may be more likely to develop the condition. So then you have the right setting, like George Bray said, and then later on Caldwell Esselstyn said, that genetics loads the gun and lifestyle pulls the trigger. That's what happens. So we think genetics plays a huge role, because there are gene receptor defects, insulin receptor defects. There are all kinds of genetic issues that can be linked in with polycystic ovary syndrome. And then when you then add on the lifestyle, where you have a sedentary life, you're stressed, you're eating highly processed foods, ultra processed foods. Remember, 60% of our diet in the Western world is made of ultra processed foods and saturated fat. So we know that insulin resistance then comes into play. And when one is living in a larger body or carrying excess weight, that makes the condition even worse. So losing some amount of weight can actually make a big difference in normalizing your hormones. But losing weight is easier said than done. So we always say, and throughout the book we explain, that always focus on health goals. I want to get pregnant, or I want my periods to come back, I want my acne to get better. Those are better goals, because when you try and focus on weight, almost always people will put all the weight back. So genetics, insulin resistance, excess weight, those are the drivers, those are the possible causes of PCOS. Whether polycystic ovary syndrome causes people to put on more weight, we have evidence to suggest that as well. And whether weight itself worsens your PCOS or makes you get PCOS, we have evidence for that as well. But remember, 2 out of 3 women actually do not have excess weight. And so when we do CT scans and MRIs, we may find some of them will have increased abdominal fat, and that may be triggering the insulin resistance. I don't know whether you've discussed enough about insulin resistance in the past, but it's essentially a hormone produced by the pancreas, which is a tail-shaped organ, and it's responsible for driving the glucose that is produced by breaking down the food that we eat into the cells so that they can be used, because it's the major source of energy. So when the cells in your body get blocked by fat, whether it's saturated fat or your own body fat, what happens is this insulin cannot do its job, so the insulin levels start rising. And when the insulin levels start rising, then the blood sugars start rising. And so you can imagine that you then start having problems like gestational diabetes and pregnancy-induced diabetes and type 2 diabetes by the time you're 40 and even earlier. So it's so important to understand that insulin resistance is not just causing that shift in harder shift, but insulin itself starts stimulating insulin-like growth factors, which then make your ovaries produce even more testosterone and actually make the condition of PCOS even worse. And that is why losing about 5 to 10% of your body weight melts that fat around your cells, helps to bring the testosterone levels down, improves the acne, improves the hair growth, improves your ovulation. So it's very, very intertwined. So insulin has got many actions, not just on blood sugar. And that's, again, something that we discuss in great detail about how, and of course, there are other things like endocrine disruptors and, stuff that we eat, especially red meat and things. They often have organic pollutants and endocrine disruptors and mammalian estrogen. All these things really matter. That's why a fiber-rich diet, a whole food plant-based diet that focuses on colorful fruits, lots of vegetables, lots of whole grains, potatoes with skin, sweet potatoes with the skin, beans and legumes and lentils and green peas and soya and herbs and nuts and seeds. All these things are so important. The colorful, varied diet that feeds your gut bacteria, feeds you with fiber, and then normalizes your hormone, because this is an endocrine driven hormonal condition. That is why lifestyle makes such a role. And of course, you have to bring in exercise and sleep and stress and avoid smoking and alcohol. So there's a lot of stuff that is going on, very complex, but there is so much hope available. There's no cure for it, but there is a lot of hope. So I don't like to use the word reversal. There are a couple of studies that have shown reversal, but what I would suggest is always think of it as remission, because if you go back to getting stressed, if you go back to sleeping poorly, if you go back to eating a standard American diet, then you're going to be back again in the throes of the condition.
That's exactly right. So there's so many things there. It affects heart disease, hypertension, diabetes, all of these things that you're describing.
And womb cancer actually is the commonest cause of womb cancer in women under the age of 35. Yes, because you're not having periods, so there's unopposed estrogen. And so if you're not missing periods, the lining starts thickening. And if you don't shed that regularly with the help of medication or by changing your lifestyle, then that can make you at a higher risk, especially if you're carrying excess weight. So type 2 diabetes, heart disease, womb cancer, these are all risks. And actually $8 billion was spent last year in the US, Laurie, for healthcare related to polycystic ovary syndrome. It should be a public health issue, because of pregnancy-related complications and type 2 diabetes, but nobody's talking about it. And that really upsets me. So, which is why we wrote the book. We wanted people to, and the book is a bright pink color. It's very, very sort of accessible. It looks like a fiction book. It is thick because it's got lots of references, hundreds and hundreds of references, but more importantly, recipes. Because there's no point me discussing that PCOS is a hormonal condition. There's no point me discussing about the acne and the excess hair growth and the infertility or the excess weight or the insulin resistance, because you need to know what to do with that information. That is why part 4, written by Rohini, my daughter, who's a nutritionist, basically tells people how to take charge of their own lives and actually meeting them where they are. So nobody's expecting you to suddenly change your diet overnight. It's making these small steps, whether it is going for a walk. It's a domino effect. When you go for a walk in the outdoors with a friend, you're laughing. When you come home, you want to make better choices of eating. When you eat better, you tend to sleep better. When you sleep better, you don't want to have that drink, and you don't need, all that risky substances. And so then you want to exercise. And so you can see there's like a beautiful effect one way or the other. When you sleep poorly, you stress more. When you stress more, you reach out for the wrong foods. When you reach out for the wrong foods, you have negative body image. And so it goes on. So it works both ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And they can get your book where, if they live in the US?
In Barnes and Noble, as well as Amazon.com, or if you are, or any of the different, bookstores. But basically
retailers.
online, and you can just look up, it's called Living PCOS Free, which basically means, it's a mnemonic actually. P stands for plants, C for community, O for optimism. I'm sorry about my dogs.
That's okay. That's okay. There's one
Somebody's
over
at
here.
the door. So PCOS Free stands for P for plants, C for community, O for being optimism, S for self-care, and F for fun. It's so important to have fun and not take life too seriously, because it's so easy to sort of go down a rabbit hole. And then E is for empowering, and E is for exercise. So it's really, or exercise comes before empowering. So empowering oneself allows you to ask the right questions so that you can advocate for yourself, for your own health. Because as I say in one of my chapters, nobody loves your body better than you.
That's true. I wish more people did love their bodies more. There's so many women struggle with body image and all those issues.
Because we've been told that for generations, for centuries, isn't it? So that's why, if there's one thing that people want to take away from the book or from this podcast, I want people to talk to themselves as if they would be talking to their best friend, to the one who they really love. So because we often feed ourselves such negative words that any of the good that we want to do through diet or exercise, we undo because we are being harsh on ourselves. And so just stop and think, would I say this to somebody I love and care for the most? If the answer is no, don't say it to yourself.
That's absolutely true. Well, I do have another question, if you don't mind. It's kind of off from the PCOS, but because you're a specialist and I get a lot of questions regarding it, is how can lifestyle intervention help around menopause? I feel like that's another topic you should write your second book about. But
I am. I've already started writing my second book on menopause.
Fantastic, because it's such a difficult stage, right? You're not only going through these physical changes, but your children have left home, and it's like you're not. It's just a lot of things going on.
It's a lot of things going on. And we are in an unusual situation, because don't forget, life expectancy was, I don't know, 32 years, 35 years, about 100, 150 years ago, probably 50 years for the privileged, or 55 years. Queen Victoria lived till late, but generally speaking, women died in childbirth. So, it was not normal to have periods. If you think about it, people would start their periods at 14 or 15, they would get pregnant, they would be nursing, they would die in childbirth. And if they did have 10 or 12 children, then they would probably have about a handful of periods by the time they were menopausal. And so menopause is basically, as I explained, when the critical level of the eggs in your ovaries drop and you stop your periods for 12 months. But there's a whole period before that that is just as important, called perimenopause, and that can last anywhere between 2 to 8 years. And the average age of menopause is 51, but the range is 45 to 55. So do your calculations. Perimenopause can start in your late 30s.
Wow.
Okay. And you can have symptoms where suddenly you're having hot flushes and mood swings and night sweats and all these early menopausal type symptoms. There are about 34 of them described, and they can start and then they suddenly become better and then they get worse again. There's crowding of your periods. Your periods that were coming maybe every 28 or 30 days are now coming every 24 days. You may notice that the periods are getting a bit heavier. So you shouldn't be really ignoring those things. And you think you're starting to forget a few things. So those that perimenopausal time is really super, super important. That's why I say it's never too early or never too late to bring in lifestyle changes. And all these lifestyle changes, Laurie, that I described for PCOS, it's the same whether you want to avoid dementia or whether you want to manage your menopausal symptoms. About 2 out of 3 women out of 10 come forward with their symptoms. 85% of women in the Western world suffer from hot flushes, the most common known symptoms. And those that carry excess weight suffer even more with hot flushes, paradoxically, even though they have higher levels of estrogen. And we know that estrogen is the most effective therapy for menopause, to manage menopausal symptoms, especially in the early stage. So the question I would pose to people is, understand about menopause, I have a lot of free fact sheets on my website that basically go through every single, whether it's menopause, whether it's perimenopause, whether it's menopausal hormone therapy, whether it's endometriosis, whether it's heavy periods or painful periods or painful sex. I have about 50 different fact sheets on my website, and it's very simple. Just put my name in, nitubajekal.com. You can download it, you can read it. It won't cost you anything. You don't even have to buy the Living PCOS free book. You can get it all for free, on my website. So menopause is a time where you never become, people say, oh, I've been through the menopause. You don't actually, you're always in the postmenopausal phase. And it's a very important time of life. So if you imagine the average age is 51 and the average life expectancy is 81 years, I think in the US, is 82 point something in the UK, it's 80, even higher in Hong Kong. So there's a good 30 years of a life that you can actually celebrate. And so it's so important to empower yourself and not look at it as a negative with aging and things like that. So making those changes, those lifestyle changes are really important, but also knowing that there is help available, whether it's in the form of menopausal hormone therapy, which is very safe for the vast majority, and you need estrogen and progesterone and perhaps testosterone if you have an intact uterus. And if you've had a hysterectomy, you just need estrogen, because estrogen is the one that manages all the symptoms. Progesterone is needed to protect the lining of your womb from cancer if you just took estrogen on its own. So, all this information should be available to women right from school age, so that you know how to deal with these clinical symptoms, and you're suddenly not faced with the empty nest syndrome. You're caring for older parents, you are the sandwich in the middle, you're the filling in the middle, the hummus in the middle, as I would say, So it's so important to self-care should have been built in right from, because women always put themselves last. It's everything, isn't it? It's your children, then it's your partner, then it's your work, then it's your pet, or whichever order you wanted. In our house, the dogs are the top dogs. So, you basically are always we put ourselves last. And I think I want women to, whether you have PCOS, whether you have endometriosis, whether you have no medical conditions, whether you're approaching menopause, it doesn't matter. It is not a selfish act to look after yourself, because only when you start looking after yourself can you start spreading happiness and looking after people outside, outside of your own world. So it's so important to do that. And so I hope that people will realize that menopause, like in many societies elsewhere in the world, they look at it as a positive thing. And maybe we should also start doing that. It doesn't mean to say that, you should neglect yourself if you want to, have, I don't know, laser or Botox or, color your hair or whatever. It doesn't matter. Nobody should be judging you, but also look after your health.
Absolutely.
Bring in those fruits, those vegetables. If you're somebody who doesn't eat any fruit, start with one fruit. If you're somebody who eats one fruit a day, make it 2 and slowly build it up. Same thing with vegetables, same thing with whole grains. Don't be scared of carbohydrates. Those who don't eat carbohydrates, complex and simple carbohydrates we're not talking about white rice and cakes and biscuits and cookies. We are talking about fruits and vegetables and legumes and whole grains. The global, the Lancet, the global burden of disease study that looked at 175 countries basically found that this 11 million deaths would be prevented if we ate our vegetables and our whole grains and our beans. So it's so important. It doesn't matter what else you eat. Don't focus on what you're not eating.
Right.
Always focus on what you're bringing in. So crowd out those other foods. Don't think I'm not eating my chicken or my meat or my cake or my donut. And the other thing I find which really helps my patients and helps me is, instead of saying I can't, always say I don't want to. So somebody says have a piece of cake, then you say, actually, you know what, I don't want it. Not that I can't have it, I'm on a diet. The moment you say I can't, is deprivation. The moment you say don't, you're in control. Or somebody says, come on, go on, have a glass of wine. We know that even having 3 units of alcohol, especially in the menopause, increases our breast cancer risk between 12 and 15%. So it's so important to say, today I've chosen not to drink, or today I'm not drinking. So then that pressure is taken off, or I don't want to, those are more empowering words than I can't, I shouldn't, I'm being naughty, it's guilty, I'm feeling guilty, or that's a bad food, this is a good food, that's a superfood. I don't like any of those words. I just think they tend to make us feel very confused and want things more, rather than actually, taking it in your stride. I was very naughty. I made my daughters think that salad was dessert. So when they were young, please, mommy, can we have salad for dessert? Only if you're very, very good.
That's wonderful. Oh, goodness. Well, that's fabulous. I mean, it's so very key to understand that all of these factors in women's health can be addressed with lifestyle interventions, everything that you discussed, everything that's on your website. So thank you for those free resources. We'll put a link, of course, to your website and, of course, to the book, Living PCOS Free, which is fabulous. Is there any final advice you'd like to give someone? I know I've kept you almost an hour already, that for someone who's maybe suffering or struggling and confused or considering employing these type of lifestyle changes?
I would say, first of all, don't forget, everybody is different. And, many of us are in positions of privilege. So don't think that eating a plant-based diet involves having chia seeds and blueberries and things that are expensive. So I always tell my students, I tell the public I speak to, I do cooking classes for a community organization where people don't have access to a blender or anything other than a knife and a small stove. So I always say, go to the ethnic supermarkets or the markets or the open markets, go to your local supermarket at the end of the day when all the produce has been really slashed, because a lot of people in the US, I know, live in food deserts. So, buy things in bulk. So beans and things which are dry, they shouldn't cost you a lot of money. Sadly, the government doesn't subsidize the real foods that will change our health. And, there's a vested interest with all this. So I really would say, think of where you are in your life and bring one little change every single week, maybe, just switching a few things here and there can actually make a big difference. And then you will start seeing that you'll actually save money because your health will feel better, you will feel more energetic, and you'll make those choices that will allow you to, learn how to cook at home. These are simple tips that, because you may be a busy mom with, lots of young children, and it's easier sometimes to feed them ready-made stuff, but you will actually, once you see how much money you will save when you make some baked potatoes with some baked beans and make hummus at home or whatever, you can decide what foods you like. Everybody has cultural preferences, and all those preferences can be made plant-based, and they can be made plant-based. So we have over 30 or 40 recipes in our book that really are from pantry ingredients, where you don't always have to have lots of fresh produce. So I hope that people realize that instead of being hard on oneself, just starting where you can and being kind to yourself. If you take a few steps back, that's okay. Get up and make the next step forward.
Absolutely. That's perfect. Address so many different things and just keeping it simple. And absolutely, they call it the diet of paupers for a reason. It's because it's cheaper and healthier. So wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time today. It was wonderful. I'm so glad this is such an important topic that we need to address. And I'm looking forward to success in your book.
Thank you. Thank you, Laurie, for inviting me. I know it's a lot of information to pack in, and I hope I've been able to get that across to your listeners. But all this information, as I said, is on my website, which people can read in their own time, because sometimes it can get overwhelming when you have to say so much of medical information. You and I can understand it sometimes because we have that background. So I always say, spend time to listen to the podcast a couple of times, maybe go on to the website, because I try and again talk as simply as possible, hopefully helping people.
Absolutely. Well, it's refreshing to see someone so joyous about their career in medicine, because it's many places not the case. And so I do appreciate that so much. And thank you again. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed that video. Before you go though, please hit the subscribe and alert buttons so you don't miss out on any of the amazing content we're working so hard to provide you. We upload a new episode of Health and More with Dr. Lori Marbus every Friday. Now, if you'd rather listen to the podcast, you can find us on all the major platforms such as iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, and even Spotify. If you're looking for amazing resources to help you start and sustain a plant-based diet, exercise, recipes, or anything wellness, we got you covered there too. Because at Mora, we actually provide physician-led support groups to help people live happier, healthier lives free of metabolic disease. Don't forget to check out our website at mora.com, and thanks again for watching.